Hey everybody, it's Connor here, one half of From the Margins with a special update. So, because of extenuating life circumstances, From the Margins will be taking a indefinite hiatus, and in the meantime, I will be uploading RenFare episodes on the main channel just to keep our algorithm alive. So, keep on listening, keep on watching, and enjoy. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of RenFreud, an extension of From the Margins with Violet and Connor. I am, of course, Connor RenFare, and today we will be discussing Sigmund Flicks and his titular Netfro original series. I'll split the discussion into two parts. First, I'll give a spoiler-free discussion of how Freud's biography and theories are used in the show. By spoiler-free, I mean I won't be revealing any secrets or ruining any of the plot twists. I will divulge some crucial plot elements for the sake of clarity, but nothing I say in the first part will take away from your enjoyment if you're the kind of person who wants to be surprised. After that, I will give my spoiler review. So first is Freud's biography as it pertains to the show. In 1882, Freud has his medical license and is working in Vienna General Hospital. He is mostly stationed in Theodor Meynelt's psychiatric clinic. During his tenure, he started experimenting with cocaine. In 1885, Freud gets a fellowship study with Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris, where he works with hysteria patients and hypnosis. And in 1886, Freud worked with Josef Breuer to introduce hypnosis in a clinical setting, and this is when the first season takes place. So the show opens in Vienna in 1886. Austria and Hungary have merged into a single empire ruled by King Emperor Franz Joseph. These are the years leading up to World War I, before the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. There are whispers of a plot by Hungarian dissidents to assassinate the sitting emperor. Sigmund Freud is in his late 20s, he's addicted to cocaine, and he's doing his residency at Vienna General Hospital. He's ethnically Jewish but is an atheist. We do see him eating with his family on Sabbath, and his mother chastises him for seeing patients when he should be resting. The show doesn't do a lot to show Freud's conflict with faith, but what it does show is how anti-Semitism contributes to no one taking him seriously. You could say his wacky ideas were enough to discredit him, but almost every belief about mental health was equally wacky at that time. More on that later. Sigmund Freud is trying to become famous because he has a bit of a god complex. He believes that he is destined to change the world. This is actually true to his biography as well. He was born with a caul, a C-A-U-L, or a piece of the amniotic sac still stuck to his face. His mother believed, as was the superstition, that God had blessed her firstborn with incredible brilliance, and she raised him with preferential treatment and the assurance that he would do great things. You can see why he had mommy issues. Another reason Freud wants to get fame and fortune is so he can convince his girlfriend's mom to let him propose to her. Martha Bernays is Freud's real-life love and correspondent. They would go on to get married, have 6 children, and be cremated together after death. She's largely absent from the first season of the show, which makes sense historically since she lived with her parents in Hamburg until Freud could afford to impress them. But the pilot does treat us to a sample of their actual correspondence. We get a quote in the show from one of his real letters in which he writes, "Woe to you, my princess, when I come. I will kiss you quite red and feed you till you are plump. And if you are forward, you shall see who is the stronger, a gentle little girl who doesn't eat enough, or a big, wild man who has cocaine in his body." We also get Martha's reply to this letter, but I can't find that text online, and I don't want to rewatch the episode just to find that one bit of dialogue. At the Vienna General Hospital, Freud is working with, or being mentored by, it's unclear, Josef Breuer, to promote hypnotherapy as a treatment option for hysteria. Breuer is the only other Jewish clinician and a close confidant of Freud. Meynelt's clinic believes that nervous disorders stem from organ failures or other physiological causes. Just look at the word hysteria, which comes from hyster, or womb. Doctors of the day believed that women were going crazy because their uteri were broken. Freud is beginning to believe that mental issues are the cause of these nervous disorders. Meynalt's clinic serves male and female patients, but only women get diagnosed with hysteria. Hysteria is a diagnosis used to blanket several nervous symptoms like psychosomatic compulsions, like coughing or laughing, non-physiological paralysis, blindness, or muteness, meaning there's no physical reason why the patient should have those symptoms, fits or seizures, and unladylike behavior. Historically, Freud's work began a shift from theories of physiological origination of nervous disorders to the mental origination. The mind is as powerful as an observable organ, and it needs just as much help to stay healthy. Now, don't confuse the brain with the mind. This isn't just chemical imbalances. Freud is talking about thoughts, memories, drives, beliefs, ideas, etc. Now, let's talk about hypnosis. Wikipedia defines hypnosis as focused attention, reduced peripheral awareness, and an enhanced capacity to respond to suggestion. Now, we're all familiar with stage hypnotism. That's where the hypnotist brings an audience participant on stage, puts them in a trance, and then makes them dance like a chicken. What hypnotherapy does is draw focus to issues that need to be addressed and suggest positive thoughts or behaviors to combat negative ones. If a smoker wanted to kick the habit, they could go to a hypnotherapist and be put into a trance and have their addiction kind of suggested away, like, whatever makes you crave a cigarette, do this behavior instead, think this thought instead. Redirect that craving into some other behavior. So Charcot and Breuer used hypnotism to address what they believed were the psychosomatic causes of hysteria or other nervous disorders. After working with them, Freud began to revise his understanding as the mind possessing a conscious and an unconscious. In real life, Freud begins to question the efficacy of hypnotism as a cure because of its use of suggestion. Since Freud is more interested in recovering repressed memories, he worries that hypnotists can implant false memories in their patients. In the show, Freud is so insecure about his ability to hypnotize people that he rehearses a fake hypnotism routine with his housekeeper. At one point, he does manage to put her in a trance and implants the rehearsed scenario into her. So now she has fake memories. The show also introduces a brand new character named Fleur Salomé. She is a medium living as a ward with the Count and Countess of Sapari, two Hungarian expats in Vienna. Fleur performs seances and soothsayings at lavish parties. Remember what I said about the real-life Sigmund Freud being born with a caul? In this show, Fleur is born with a veil, which is the same thing. And this is part of the explanation behind her psychic powers. Fleur is also a somnambulist. There was a fascination in German culture around somnambulism, or sleepwalking. For example, Robert Wiener's Das Kabinett des Dr. Caligari is a 1920 film about a doctor who hypnotizes a sleepwalker to commit murders. As a somnambulist, Fleur is incredibly susceptible to hypnosis, and while in a trance state, she can use her psychic powers. Let's see Freud's other theories enacted on the screen. First, we have the unconscious. Basically, there are dark chambers of the mind where our repressed desires lie. Freud uses the analogy of himself being a dark house. He can walk around with a candle, but he can't illuminate all of it at once. There are still other rooms, other hallways, and dark shadows all around. The villains of this show are able to draw on repressed aggression to puppeteer their victims, and that's probably the best application of Freudian theory in the entire show. Freud was also very interested in the interpretation of dreams. He believed our dreams reveal the hidden or latent thoughts in our unconscious. In this show, we have several dream sequences that reveal details about the characters. There are also dream sequences that reveal backstory and really weird plot details regarding Fleur. Then we have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Freud was one of the first thinkers to connect trauma with nervous disorders. Now, I'm not going to say he got it right on the first try. I'm also not giving credit to Freud for discovering PTSD. But in a scientific age when doctors looked for physiological causes for symptoms, Freud championed examining the mind. It wouldn't be until after World War I, or 30 years after the first season of this show, that Freud would begin his work with veterans, but we do see a hint of it now. Alfred Kiss, a police inspector and veteran of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, exhibits many of the symptoms of PTSD we would recognize today, as well as several nervous tics. His right hand locks up whenever he pulls his pistol, which obviously hampers his ability as a police inspector. What's interesting is that, given the time period, hysteria is seen as a women-only affliction, and it's through his work with Kiss that Freud begins to destigmatize and desegregate the idea of nervous disorders. In another dream sequence, we also see Kiss battling with a demon that represents his PTSD. Two more theories we see are transference and displacement. Transference is when a patient in therapy begins to project feelings onto their therapist. If the patient is recounting traumatic or shameful experiences, they could begin to grow angry or resentful toward their therapist. While working through parental issues, the patient might regard their therapist as a parental figure. When discussing past or current relationship issues, the patient might fall in love with their therapist. Displacement, on the other hand, is a defense mechanism where a subject redirects their negative feelings from one target to another, like when a man endures his boss's abuse at the office and goes home to scream at his wife. He's actually upset with his boss, but since he's powerless in that dynamic, he vents his frustration and anger onto someone he does have power over. I introduced these separate concepts together because the show kind of combines them. While working with Fleur, Freud becomes attracted to her and she to him. Breuer warns Freud about the real-life incident with Bertha Pappenheim, who got the pseudonym Anna O in Breuer's papers. She was a neurotic patient who coined the phrase talking cure while working with Breuer. So basically, Pappenheim couldn't be consistently hypnotized, so they opted just to talk instead. This ended up being the precursor to Freud's setup of free association and psychotherapy. Apparently, Pappenheim fell in love with Breuer, and the two of them crossed a boundary. Breuer now believes that Freud and Fleur are going down the same road. Next, we get to everybody's favorite one, the parapraxis, or what is popularly called a Freudian slip. Thoughts or feelings that we're trying to repress find a way out through slips of the tongue. An example would be when I was going to present a group project to my high school literature class. My friend had made the PowerPoint last minute based on our collective notes, but I was nervous and wanted an idea of what the presentation would look like, so I attempted to ask her, "Can you give me some heads up?" But my brain kept trying to put in the word leeway, which of course means freedom of movement to accomplish a task. So was I concerned that my friend's presentation would be too confining for me to adequately convey my point? Or was I anxious about having too much freedom as the presenter? Either way, as I was talking, I became aware that my brain had amalgamated heads up and leeway into headway. In an effort to avoid using this Franken word, I cut myself off and tried to conjure up the word I actually meant. My friend, consequently, was horrified because I had just asked her in front of our group, "Can you give me some head?" And then I went on to give my analysis of the cunnilingus scene in André Dubus's House of Sand and Fog. In the show, while writing one of his steamy love letters to Martha, Freud accidentally addresses it to Fleur. This part doesn't make much mechanical sense because he writes the addressee's name at the end of the letter, which conventionally that's where he should write his own name. You know, it's like Love Sigmund, right? But instead he said Fleur when he obviously meant to say Martha, but why was he putting the addressee at the end of the letter? Another notorious one is the Oedipus complex. During the genital stage of psychosexual development, or ages 3 to 6, young boys become jealous of their fathers for being married to their mothers. We get to see a dream sequence of Freud killing his father and having intercourse with his mother. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with the plot or Freud's character development. I guess it's an Easter egg for people who know anything about Freud. Now for the fun part where I give my review with spoilers. Here's your chance to close out the broadcast if you want to be surprised by what happens. And you will be surprised. The plot beats in this show are outrageous and honestly don't make much sense at all. And because I have so many issues with the plot, I have to get into it. It's so obviously meant to be a show that gets binged in 1 or 2 sittings. The episodes don't contain encapsulated stories, but rather exist as awkwardly segmented chunks in an 8-hour movie. You know, you would think that there would be a cohesive plot for each episode, and episode 1 would end with at least a resolution of the immediate story with enough to carry us further into the rest of it. But instead, it just throws a bunch of questions on you and abruptly ends and picks right back up in episode 2. Now, when I first started the series, I thought it would be kind of a crime procedural like Criminal Minds, where famous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud has to use his controversial theories to help detectives track down disturbed killers. Oh, these victims all look the same and were killed in the same way. The killer obviously has mommy issues or a foot fetish. You're telling me these cadavers were castrated? The culprit must have penis envy and is getting revenge on the masculine sex. Something like that. But no, it's a dark fantasy series, and it's not even a particularly bad dark fantasy. The setting is novel, the use of Austro-Hungarian folklore is interesting, the socio-political tensions are compelling. The series is just confused about whether it wants to be about Sigmund Freud or about the world that it's creating, And rather than explore the psychopathology that Freud pioneered, the series instead focuses on hypnosis, a practice which predates Freud and which Freud abandoned before even beginning his private practice. And even worse, the hypnosis in the show has no internal consistency. Breuer and Freud treat it as a science and a methodology, and their scenes go to great lengths to illustrate how hypnotism works in the show's universe. Now, I don't know enough about hypnotism to comment on how factual the portrayal is. All that matters to me is that the show establishes rules and then sticks to those rules. But then we get a character who can seemingly break those rules. Countess Sofia von Sapari, the Hungarian expat and leader of a Hungarian nationalist cell, is able to put Freud in a trance just by touching his head and commanding him to sleep. Now, sources tell me that she's actually affecting his biorhythms with the cadence of her voice and calculated touch. But it still just happens really fast, like instantaneous. Maybe I'm nitpicking here. Sophia is also able to hypnotize Fleur just as easily, but I'll buy that one. Fleur is a somnambulist. It's established that they are more susceptible to trances and suggestions. Also, Fleur was raised by Sophia, meaning that Sophia had years to condition Fleur to fall into a trance, at her whim. But then there's even more magic, because it turns out Fleur is a Taltos. Now, just watching the show, you would think this is some kind of mystical being, like a god on earth. The psychic abilities Fleur possesses are because she ostensibly has a god sleeping inside of her that Sophia can manipulate through hypnotism. But then the Taltos wakes up and takes over Fleur's body. Not that that actually has any plot relevance or anything. Anyway, I did my research and turns out a Taltos is just a shaman. I didn't get that impression from the show. Maybe I missed something. But it actually made sense after I researched it. The Taltos is born with a veil, or a call, just like Freud. The Taltos can also communicate with the spirit realm. So this explains Fleur's abilities to mediate with the dead and see the future, I guess. But then rather than a separate godlike being inside of her, Fleur actually has a dissociative identity that calls itself the Taltos. Now, Freud didn't have a cogent theory on dissociative identity disorder, probably because it didn't get officially added into the DSM-4 until 1994. But dissociation and theories of fractured identity were all over the place in his day. I'll spare you the details, but Freud already theorized a model of the self with the capacity for dissociation and fugue states. Also, dissociation, somnambulism, and hysteria all hung out together in clinical literature of the era. The showrunners probably saw Freud mention dissociation in regards to hysteria in his early research and decided to just stick it in the show. Whatever. So just as a reminder of how convoluted this all is, Fleur is a Taltos, a medium who can see the future and perform seances. She is also a somnambulist or a sleepwalker. Countess Sophia Zapari puts Fleur in a trance to control her psychic powers, but also uses her to hypnotize the youth of Vienna as part of her plot to assassinate the emperor. And Fleur also has a second identity that calls itself the Taltos, but it still participates in the schemes, so it doesn't actually have to be in the show at all. Freud also uses hypnosis on Fleur so they can solve the murders that Fleur was an accessory to. But because she's in a fugue state from the hypnosis, she's in a trance, Fleur has no memory that she's actually a part of these murders. So, she's an accessory but also helping to solve them. I guess that's an interesting tension that goes nowhere. Now, what are these murders I'm talking about? Pretty early on, we learn that the Zaparis are hypnotizing young men in Vienna, and their targets go on to commit gruesome murders. Now, how does all of this tie back to the Zaparis' scheme to kill the emperor? It doesn't. The murderers are just the men whose inner darkness is too strong to be controlled, and once unleashed, wreaks havoc on people. So one dude cuts off his younger sister's toes. An opera singer eats his own parents. I'm guessing this is related to their ids and their libidos or life drives being warped. The Zaparis plot ultimately takes 2 minutes to be initiated and thwarted in the final episode. What was it all building up to? I don't know. And the show isn't actually that terrible. I already said how enticing the ideas are. In my opinion, it should have just been a full period fantasy. Freud, as a historical figure, didn't offer anything to the plot. They use his ideas, but these are all theories that he developed years after the show is set. So you could just put Freudian theory in the show divorced of Freud. Plenty of literature uses Freudian theory anyway. It doesn't have to be him. He doesn't even use his own psychoanalysis to contribute to the plot. It could have been any fictional medical student working in the mental clinic. And honestly, he's not even that compelling as a central character. They could have just created a new character who just served as one piece of a giant ensemble cast where everybody has an equal part and you just have these different plots and you don't know how they're connected until the end, which is basically what the show tried to do. But because they had a central character of Freud, he just got involved in everybody else's business and probably should have solved the crime a lot faster since he was present for all of the plot relevant details. Also, the fact that he's involved in so many plot lines gives it kind of a side quest feeling. So there are 3 different murders I mentioned, and he basically solves the first one, by episode 2. He knows who the culprit is, but rather than take immediate action, the plot requires him to then go and deal with somebody else's plot line. So it feels like he's doing a side quest. It's okay, well, I don't really want to advance the story yet, so let me go do this errand real quick, and then I'll confront the culprit, who's just going to sit there and wait for me to get him because I know he's the culprit. He knows I know I'm the culprit, but we're just not going to take immediate action on this fever pitch we raised the plot to. If anything, this season only served as an origin story for Dr. Freud, because by the end he learns more about how minds work. We get to see the inspirations for what will later become his theories. It concludes with him leaving his job at the hospital and beginning his own private practice, which is, what historically happens. He leaves the hospital and becomes his own psychotherapist. And he gets engaged to Martha. Yay. Well, that was my episode on Freud. It took me 6 hours to compile all of my notes, and I finished recording it in fewer than 30 minutes. That's wonderful. Okay, everybody, take care, stay safe, wash your hands, and keep listening.